And now for the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are in the lands of the Anishinaabe Nation. This spot where we gather is the traditional lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ottawa, Potawatomi, Onojibwe. And we also recognize that this land is now home to the Delaware Nation. This land was settled through the McKee Purchase Treaty of 1790, and we, as the beneficiaries of the treaty, must recognize our responsibilities, including our collective responsibilities to the land and water. Mr. Mayor, there is not a supplementary agenda this evening, and the rules for the council chambers. The municipality of Chatham-Kent supports open meetings that welcome debate of public policy issues in an atmosphere that is inclusive, integrity, civility, fairness, and respect for differing points of view. Anyone conducting themselves in a way that disturbs, disrupts, or impedes the orderly conduct of the meeting, interrupts or makes derogatory statements or hate speech, defamatory comments about councillors, staff, speakers, or fellow members of the public may result in the removal of the premise. The use of posters, signage, and literature is also prohibited. Mr. Mayor, we have one pecuniary interest from a councillor. Councillor Story has declared a conflict of interest on item 11G, application for zoning bylaw amendment, Cherry Grove Community Inc., Delaware Avenue. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Planning Services.
Thank you, Mayor Caniff. The process to be followed for each planning application will be as follows. 1, the clerk will announce each individual planning item. 2, the mayor will ask if there is anyone present other than the applicant or their agent with an interest in the application and to indicate so by raising their hand. 3, the clerk will advise if anyone is present virtually wishing to speak. 4, if someone other than the applicant or the applicant's agent indicates an interest in the item, there will be a short presentation by administration. 5, individuals with an interest in the application other than the applicant will be asked to proceed to the podium, provide their name and address, and address council. 6, the applicant will be asked if they wish to proceed to the podium and address council. 7, administration will be asked if they have any other comments based on any discussion that may have occurred. And 8, council will be asked what action it wishes to take with regard to the item. If any person or public body that files an appeal of a decision of council in respect of an application does not make oral or written submissions to the municipality before the proposal is approved, they are not entitled to appeal a decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal if otherwise eligible, unless in the opinion of the tribunal there are reasonable grounds to add the person or public body as a party to the appeal. Information on council's actions tonight will be posted to the municipal website. All persons who have made a request or have made an oral or written submission regarding an item will receive a notice of council's decision, including appeal procedures. Any other person who wishes to receive a notice of decision must make a request to the municipal clerk. Thank you.
11A, application for consent and zoning bylaw amendment, Cedar Hedge Farms Limited, 6854 and 6861 St. Philippe's Line, Community of Dover, North Kent. Mr. Mayor, I do not have any conflict of interest and I did not receive any deputations.
Is there anyone present other than the applicant and or the agent with an interest in this application? If so, please indicate by raising your hand. Seeing none, can I get Councillor Juvenville and Councillor McGrail to move this, please?
I so move.
And I will second.
Any questions? Seeing none, we'll put it to vote.
Councillor Bondi?
Councillor Bondi, are you there?
Okay,
Councillor
Councillor
McGregor?
McGregor?
Yes.
Thank you. All votes are in. Motion passes. Moving on to 11B, application for consent and zoning bylaw amendment, Eric Vinn and Tara Fion, 12046 Beechwood Line, Community of Howard, East Kent. There were no conflict of interest and I did not receive any deputations.
Is there anyone present other than the applicant and or agent with an interest in this application? If so, please indicate by raising your hand. Seeing none, Councillor Pinstone and Councillor Wright, can I get you to move this, please?
I would move that, Your Worship.
I would second that, thank you.
Any questions? Seeing none, we'll put it to vote.
Councillor Carmen McGregor
Yes.
and Councillor Bondi.
Yes.
Thank you. All votes are in and motion passes. Moving on to item 11C, application for consent and zoning bylaw amendment. Chris Gardner and Tracy Haskell, 4334 Middle Line, Community of Tilbury East, West Kent. Mr. Mayor, I do not have any conflict of interest, and I did not receive any deputations on the matter.
Is there anyone present other than the applicant and or the agent with an interest in this application? If so, please indicate by raising your hand. Seeing none, Councillor Anderson and Councillor Sakachi, can I get you to move this, please?
I am happy to move that.
So seconded, Mayor Caniff.
Any questions? Seeing none, we'll put it to vote.
Councillor Bondi
Yes.
and Councillor Carmen McGregor.
Yes.
All votes are in. Motion passes 17-0. 11D, application for zoning bylaw amendment. Cody Bayshard, 17 Center Street East, Community of Tilbury, West Kent. There are no conflict of interest, and I did not receive any deputations on this matter.
Is there anyone present other than the applicant and or the agent with an interest in this application? If so, please indicate by raising your hand. Seeing none, Councillor Anderson and Councillor Thompson, can I get you to move this, please?
I so move, thank you.
And seconded.
Any questions? Seeing none, we'll put it to vote.
Councillor Carmen McGregor
Yes.
and Councillor Bondi.
Yes.
All votes are in. Motion passes 17-0. 11E, application for zoning bylaw amendment. 10000920059 Ontario Inc., Jan Mulder and Michael Stevens, 364 Grand Ave East, Community of Chatham City. There is no conflict of interest and no deputations were received.
Is there anyone present other than the applicant or the agent with an interest in the application? If so, please indicate by raising your hand. Seeing none, Councillor Story and Councillor Finn, can I get you to move this, please?
Happy to move.
Seconded.
Any questions? Seeing none, we'll put it to vote.
Councillor Bondi
Yes.
And
and
Councillor Carmen.
Councillor Carmen McGregor.
Yes.
Councillor Allen? Thank you. All votes are in. Motion passes 17-0. 11F, application for zoning bylaw amendment. Mislick Veterinary Professional Corp., 77 Margaret Ave, Community of Wallaceburg. There are no conflict of interest. I did receive one letter in support, which was emailed to council, and are not in attendance this evening.
Is there anyone present other than the applicant or the agent with an interest in the application? If so, please indicate by raising your hand. Seeing none, Councillor Hall and Councillor C. McGregor, can I get you to move this, please?
So moved, Mayor Caniff.
Any questions? Seeing none, we'll put it to vote.
Councillor C. McGregor?
Yes.
Councillor Bondi?
Yes.
Councillor Crew? All votes are in. Motion passes 17-0. 11G, application for zoning bylaw amendment. Cherry Grove Community, Inc., Delaware Ave and Idlewild Drive, Community of Chatham City. Councillor Story has declared a conflict of interest and no deputations were received on the matter.
Is there anyone present other than the applicant or the agent with an interest in the application? If so, please indicate by raising your hand. Seeing none, Councillor Allen and Councillor Bondi, can I get you to move this, please?
Happy to move it.
Any questions? Seeing none, Councillor Finn?
Thank you, Worship, through you. What about on-street parking with an increase in the number of residents that they're looking at here? What is the plan for that? Because it's already tight parking with the school right there.
Thank you, Mayor Caniff. On-street parking is reviewed later in the development process at the plan of subdivision stage, and our traffic engineers assess the neighborhood and current conditions and bring amendments to the traffic and parking bylaw to council for their consideration. So at this point in time, there has been no decisions made on what would be allowed and what wouldn't be allowed as this development builds out.
Seeing no other questions, we'll put it to vote.
Councillor Bondi
Yes.
and Councillor C. McGregor.
Yes.
All votes are in. Motion passes 15-1 with one conflict. Next one is 11H, zoning bylaw amendment, large-scale greenhouses setback from the village residential zone. No conflict of interest and no deputations were received.
Is there anyone present other than the applicant or the agent with an interest in the application? If so, please indicate by raising your hand. Seeing none, Councillor Doyle and Councillor Crew, can I get you to move this, please?
Happy to move that, Mayor Caniff.
Second.
Any questions? Seeing none, we'll put it to vote.
Councillor C. McGregor
Yes.
and Councillor Bondi.
Yes.
All votes are in. Motion passes 17-0. The final planning application is 11I, zoning bylaw amendment, agritourism use and general housekeeping items. No conflict of interest and no deputations.
Is there anyone present other than the applicant or the agent with an interest in the application? If so, please indicate by raising your hand. Seeing none, Councillor B. McGregor and Councillor Hall, can I get you to move this, please?
So moved.
So seconded.
Any questions? Seeing none, we'll put it to vote.
Councillor Bondi
Yes.
and Councillor C. McGregor.
Yes.
All votes are in. Motion passes 17-0. Mr. Mayor, as we move on, I have not received any deputations for the remainder of the agenda this evening.
We'll go to item 13, development services.
13A, Municipal Comprehensive Review, 25-year growth forecast, urban land supply, and land need analysis. We have a presentation, and Ryan, you'll introduce.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm introducing Mr. Jamie Cook from Watson and Associates Economists Limited. Jamie, as well as his colleagues at Watson, have undertaken a number of growth and rate-related studies for Chatham-Kent over the last several years. So tonight, Jamie is here to present some high-level observations and findings of this work and address any questions or comments council may have with regard to Chatham-Kent's future as it relates to urban growth and its land needs over time for new residential employment and commercial uses. So welcome Jamie to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you in person to present you the results of our land needs and growth analysis study. I'll start with a bit of an introduction. This study was commenced back in 2021. It was prepared as an update to the 2018 comprehensive review study that was prepared by Watson and Associates. And as a result of the significant growth that has been experienced in southwestern Ontario, as well as throughout the broader economic region around Chatham-Kent, and including the municipality, there was a need to relook at that growth. We were experiencing, prior to the pandemic and working our way through the pandemic, significantly more growth than what was projected in terms of housing and economic activity. That resulted in a need for a further look and a fresh look at the growth forecast to then form a background to the development charges background study, as well as the municipality's official plan. So the primary objective of the study was to look at long-term growth for each of the primary and secondary settlement areas or urban areas and remaining rural area within the municipality. And then from there, we've prepared a long-term urban land analysis for a period of up to 25 years. That's what's permitted for us to, in terms of the horizon, for us to look at as it relates to the provincial policy statement that's currently in force as of 2020. And as I mentioned, this is a critical background study to the official plan. I would also note that this is the technical work that's ultimately laying out the amount of growth that the municipality will be anticipated to accommodate over the next 25 years and the urban land requirement. But this phase of the work did not look at the location options for any potential urban expansion. That will be done through an amendment to the official plan as through a subsequent phase of this study. So I have one slide just on some of the more macroeconomic trends, and there's a lot of material in the report that we just won't be able to get into tonight, but I did want to show this one slide. It just provides a little bit of background in terms of the economic story within the broader economic region. So this is the economic region of Windsor-Sarnia, which includes Chatham-Kent, Lambton-Sarnia, and Windsor-Essex. And what it shows is labor force activity over the last 20 years, and in the dark blue. And then in the light blue, it shows labor force trends on a quarterly basis post-pandemic. So a couple of things I wanted to point out, as you can see, labor force activity was pretty flat over the last 20 years across this economic region. And you can see some of the troubles that were occurring back in the late 2000s, in 2008 and 2009, when the financial crisis hit. We saw a decline in labor force activity. We saw spikes in the unemployment rate. And around that same time, we saw an increase in the overall value of the Canadian dollar. That exchange rate situation had fairly significantly negative impacts on the export-based economy across Ontario. Chatham-Kent was hit particularly hard. If you remember back in those days, we saw a lot of job losses in the export-based sector, particularly in manufacturing. And then you can see over that period from 2009 forward, we started to see a period of gradual economic recovery, fairly slow but steady increases in labor force activity, and a slow decline in the unemployment rate. And you can see as of 2019, that rate dropped down to around 5.5%. We started to see labor force shortages. Then the pandemic hit, and we saw this quick contraction in labor force in 2020, in the summer of 2020 through the first lockdown, a big spike in unemployment. And then what's interesting to see, though, is we've seen a downward trend in the unemployment rate and a steady increase in labor force activity since that first lockdown. So from 2020 to 2023, we've seen a growth rate in the labor force activity for the broader economic region of about 4%, which is quite significant when you consider what's been happening relative to that last few years in the historical 20-year period. And I would also note that in the Sarnia region, that area has been more negatively affected by some of the oil and gas challenges that it's been currently facing. So a lot of this economic activity has really been more concentrated in Windsor-Essex and Chatham-Kent. So as we go forward now in 2023, we're back down in a very tight labor market, and ultimately that poses challenges in terms of providing opportunities for employment growth, to find labor to accommodate that, and we need housing to accommodate those people that we're trying to attract. And so you don't necessarily have all the tools in your toolbook to sort all of the broader economic challenges that are associated with this graph, but the one area where you do have more control, working with the development communities to provide housing opportunities. And so this is a key theme that you'll see throughout this document, is the need for additional housing and urban land to accommodate economic growth. So now we're going to zoom into Chatham-Kent. I wanted to just provide a bit of background on the population trends over the last decade or so. And so this is our third update to this comprehensive review study. And if you look on the left side of this graph, you can see that the population was declining from 2011 to 2015. Actually, if you go back even further to 2006, the population in Chatham has actually been declining since that time period. But that 2015 period marks another important time period. Not only did the labor force numbers start to improve around that time, we also saw a rebound in the population projections for, or the population growth rate for Chatham-Kent. And so since that time, we've seen positive population growth, and going beyond 2021, looking at building permit activity, migration trends, that activity is remaining to be quite positive over the near term. And this building permit activity here provides a bit of a more illustrative picture of what's been happening with respect to residential construction activity. So this is a summary of residential building permits for new units by structure type over the last 20 years. And you can see that Chatham-Kent's been averaging around 235 building permits per year. But again, if you go back to that 2015 period, you start to see that ramp up of growth. So, and why I keep coming back to 2015 is because trying to really illustrate that this trend reversal that we saw in growth wasn't just a COVID impact. It was something that was occurring much prior to COVID and was accelerated, you can see here, through the COVID period into 2019, 2020, and we really peaked in around 2021, as you can see. And as we now look at 2022 and 2023, where we don't show the full year because we're not through 2023 yet, but we expect building permits will probably come in around 400 new units. Things are still averaging quite stronger than they were relative to that longer historical average. That 2018 to 22 period, as you can see, significantly higher than the long-term average. Now, we would expect to see trends in activity start to moderate, particularly in 2024 through the current interest rate environment we're in. We think 2024 is going to be a tough year for the housing market, but over the long term, given the structural changes that we're seeing in the economy, given the higher rates of migration and that outward growth pressure that we're seeing from the larger urban areas of Ontario, we do expect that the long-term trajectory for Chatham-Kent is quite positive. So with that, we'll get into some of the forecast scenarios. So we prepared 3 long-term growth scenarios for Chatham-Kent, including a low, medium, and high scenario. Ultimately, the medium scenario in orange there is a scenario that we recommended for the purposes of long-term planning and land needs analysis. It's also the forecast that we've utilized for the purposes of the development charge background study. So that forecast has us growing to a population of 122,200 by 2051. I will note, for those of you who look at these numbers in detail, there is an undercount that's included in this number. I think that number is around 2.7%. I'll have to double check. That is essentially the net number of people that are ultimately missing or not captured during the census enumeration that they're added into this forecast. So that's in the 2021 number and it's in the 51 number. So it is a real number, but it's not a number that's posted by the StatsCan number typically. So a couple other things just want to point out with this forecast is you can see that it is bending over time. And so that bending of the forecast is really a result of the aging of the population and the aging of the labor force and the downward pressure that that puts on ultimately population growth. So essentially, as our population ages, we have negative growth from natural increase. So we have more deaths than births essentially on an annual basis. And that puts more pressure on the need for immigration or net migration to sustain a higher level of population. But even with strong net migration, we still expect that that long-term trend will start to flatten out over the long-term period. So this represents a growth rate of about 0.4%. So it's a steady forecast relative to what you've been experiencing over that 2006 to 2011 period. But we do think it's a reasonable forecast. It's still, to put it in a bigger scheme of things, comparatively, it's still a fairly modest rate of growth. When you look at how Ontario is growing as a whole, the province of Ontario is growing at a rate of about 1.5%, or projected to grow at a rate of 1.5% annually. Now that might be getting a little bit frothy in my opinion, but that's ultimately what the province's numbers are saying for the province over the next 25 years. The other thing I just would point out is that the 2019 numbers are here, and you can see that we've already outpaced that growth in 2021. And a lot of that growth potential wasn't even embraced in the 21 census because those permits weren't occupied yet. So you can see we're already on track to a significant outpacing of that 2019 comprehensive review. So this provides a summary of how much housing would be needed to accommodate that forecast. So over the next 30 years, from 2021 to 2051, we're projecting an average annual number of new housing units to be constructed across Chatham-Kent of 275 units a year. That's about just under a 40% increase relative to what we've been experiencing over the last 25 years from 1996 to 2021. And the other thing I would point out is that we're starting to see a shift towards more high-density housing. There was some high-density housing in the past. You can see it moderated into the last 25 years, started to pick up in 2016, and we expect that it will be a stronger component of the housing structure type going forward. And that's really a factor of demographics, so an aging population, more seniors, more needs for different forms of seniors housing and higher density housing forms, but it's also a result of declining affordability. So while you're much more competitive from a housing affordability standpoint compared to the larger urban centers across southwestern Ontario and central Ontario, housing prices are increasing here as well. That's putting downward pressure on affordability, and it's putting more upward pressure on other forms of housing like medium density housing like townhomes and apartments. So this is the employment forecast that was ultimately generated. We prepared 3 scenarios. We recommended the medium scenario, uses the reference scenario. This has the employment growing to about 46,200. Now you can see what's really kind of strange about this graph is some really serious contraction going on from 2006 to 2011. That was that economic downturn I was talking about that impacted Chatham's largely its export-based economy, but also its population growth. So with declining population and with a steep loss of manufacturing jobs, the 2006 to 2011 period was a very challenging period for the municipality. We started to flatten out post-2011, and then COVID hit, and so we had a very sharp contraction in employment in 2021 when the census was taken, but there was a very sharp rebound. So already by 2023, we're at an employment base of around 47,000. So it's an increase of about 41,000. So it's an increase of about 4,700 or so from the downturn or the bottom in 2021. About 1,500 of these jobs are expected to be in the industrial sector. So those are important to keep an eye on because those jobs need a home in terms of where they're going to be accommodated throughout existing or future industrial lands. The other jobs are what we would call mostly population related. So they're going to be related to retail, institutional, personal services, some commercial, and also some significant job numbers in work at home as well. So we're going to move on now to the needs assessment. So the provincial policy statement identifies that municipalities are required to maintain at all times a 15-year supply of designated urban lands within their municipality. Now that's on a municipal-wide basis, and that's also measured after we've accounted for intensification. So the municipality's current intensification target, which is essentially infill and redevelopment potential of residential development in built-up areas of the municipality. Again, primarily, majority of that being the primary urban centers. Once we've accounted for that intensification factor, we've looked at what is the overall demand for housing based on that forecast, and how much supply do we have to accommodate that, and do we meet that 15-year requirement? And so what this is telling us is, yes, we're meeting that 15-year requirement based on that medium growth scenario across the municipality as a whole, but in some areas like Dresden and in Tilbury, we're falling short. So there's some isolated shortages that are already starting to occur in that shorter term time period that this analysis is already pointing out. Now, the PPS also says that we can designate lands up to a 25-year period. So you can prepare forecasts for longer term periods beyond 25 years for the purpose of infrastructure planning or financial planning or other types of municipal studies, but ultimately you're not allowed under the current PPS, in sense of 2020, to designate lands beyond a 25-year need. So that is currently going through review through the 2023 PPS. We have provided consideration of that document, but ultimately we're still working within the current context of the existing legislation and planning policies. So ultimately what we've done is we've looked at the amount of housing that's being identified in these primary settlement areas and compared that to the available supply, accounting for intensification, considering densities of these lands, structure type of housing. And what we've identified is that there are shortages in a number of the primary settlement areas, including Chatham, Tilbury, Dresden, and Blenheim. So in Chatham, we have a shortfall of 139 gross hectares. In Tilbury, we have a shortfall of 18 gross hectares. In Dresden, we have a shortfall of 16 gross hectares. And in Blenheim, a shortfall of 4 gross hectares. So in total, that adds up to about 177 gross hectares of land that ultimately cannot be accommodated within the existing designated urban boundaries of these primary settlement areas or primary centers, and ultimately means that we would be looking to expansions of the urban boundary in these areas to accommodate additional growth. Now, as the other table shows, a lot of this need is not immediate except for, to some extent, in Dresden and Tilbury. But when you look at how long it takes to go from this stage we're in now in terms of preparing the study, then ultimately looking at servicing needs, ultimately the planning analysis to then figure out what the ultimate development concepts are going to be for these areas, and then ultimately the construction and marketing of housing, and then the occupancy of housing after you pull building permits. That period typically takes around 15 years. So even though there is some time for the municipality to work, we don't have as much time as we think when you go back and you look at those time frames, which is the whole reason why we look out to the long-term horizon we do, to give you time to prepare for these needs. So we also prepared a commercial lands analysis as well. So this looks at ultimately the amount of supply and demand of commercial, retail, and other associated commercial uses, including office uses and some institutional uses that would be accommodated in commercial mixed-use areas. Now, Chatham is really the primary commercial center for Chatham-Kent, and so this is really the focus of the land needs analysis. And what this ultimately identifies is that based on the supply of commercial land and the demand for commercial land, the municipalities, or the Chatham-Kent, sorry, the Chatham Urban Center has a shortfall of about 6 hectares. So that seems a bit more modest relative to the residential numbers, but given the densities of retail, you know, 6 gross hectares is still a fairly substantial amount of land that you would need to be planning for over the next 25 years. So then moving on from there, the next area we looked at was employment lands. So employment lands are essentially areas that accommodate industrial type development. And we looked at a number of the key target sectors or emerging and growth sectors across Chatham-Kent and the broader economy to see, well, what kind of sectors are we seeing we're going to be accommodating, you know, in our industrial areas over the next 25 years. And so for the first time in a long time in southwestern Ontario and even southern Ontario, we're seeing growth in manufacturing. Now, some of that growth is being stimulated through, you know, federal stimulus, but there is a emerging sector that's obviously, as you all know, that's been happening all throughout southwestern Ontario in the electronic vehicle or EV auto sector. We're seeing significant growth in places like St. Thomas and in Windsor. And if you look across the entire 400 corridor, there's about 19 EV-related auto projects that are currently underway right now across the province. Moving on to food manufacturing, this is a sector that's growing at a rate of about 3% a year in southwestern Ontario. We think Chatham-Kent's very well positioned to accommodate growth in this sector, given its location on the 400 series or the 401, and the abundance of agricultural lands and existing base in the agricultural sector that you have. The goods movement sector being largely warehousing, transportation, logistics is obviously another key growth sector. Typically results in needs for large land extensive uses. The densities are very low typically. The job yields are typically also on the low side. Precision machining is another key sector that we've identified, as well as the circular economy. So this is really the sort of has a bit of a related use relative or function related to, for example, the EV space. There's a need for the establishment of recycling centers to recycle electronic vehicle batteries. This is a sector that we're seeing starting to emerge across southwestern Ontario and into even eastern Ontario. So what do these sectors all have in common? Well, primarily they typically need large sites. They need to be, need at least have choice of a range of sites that are typically on the large or land extensive side. And they typically need to be located in areas that are unencumbered by other competing residential uses. So they typically need to be located on or in proximity to a 400 series or a limited access highway. But in some cases, they can function quite well if they're not directly along or exposed to a 400 series highway, but they do need to be located in areas that are encumbered by those other residential uses that could conflict or pose challenges in terms of access to and from the employment area. So again, we looked at the overall amount of supply of existing designated employment lands that are vacant across the municipality. This is looking specifically in the Chatham Urban Center, We compared that with demand, and then ultimately we identified the need for land. Now, these numbers don't add up perfectly because there are additional factors that go into going from net to gross. So ultimately, when we're looking at land requirements, we're looking at the amount of land required not only to accommodate the uses, but also the infrastructure and other non-employment uses that ultimately need to be accommodated in that employment area. Typically roads, stormwater, there could be easements, other things like that. When we factor those in, we've identified a gross need of about 56 gross hectares. So when we look at that overall need and compare that to existing employment areas in Chatham-Kent and in the surrounding area, that's a fairly modest-sized, if you're looking at an expansion area of 56 hectares, it's a fairly modest-sized employment area. The current PPS does allow you to look at strategic employment areas beyond a 25-year period. Doesn't allow you to designate those lands, but it can allow you to look at those areas for protection for beyond the 25-year period. The proposed PPS is considering changes to allow you to go longer than the 25-year period, so it's something that I would monitor because ultimately we feel that in order to have a critical mass and development feasibility of a new employment area, you likely would want to consider something a little larger than 56 hectares. Another area that we looked at that has a shortfall is Dresden. So again, looking at the supply and demand of land in Dresden, looking at gross land requirements, we came to a number of 8 gross hectares that were required for additional urban expansion in Dresden. So those are the 2 areas that are required to see expansions in their urban boundary for employment areas. All the other primary areas that were not mentioned ultimately had enough land to accommodate the forecast growth for residential or non-residential purposes. So just a couple other things in terms of planning for employment areas. I mentioned some of this already, that there is a limit to 25 years in the current PPS, but there are some exceptions to planning for strategic employment areas and identifying those areas beyond a 25-year period. It's important to make sure that those areas are protected from other non-employment uses that could encroach into that area over the fullness of time. And again, there's changes afoot that would potentially allow you to go longer than a 25-year period, which may be something that could be a viable outlook for you to consider. Critical mass is a key aspect. So we feel that in order to have a sufficient amount of market choice and availability of sites of different sizes and zoning, and ultimately ensure that you can accommodate a range of uses over a fairly long period of time, and it's financially feasible to go out and develop an employment area, a critical mass of land is important. I mentioned connectivity. The 400 Highway 401 access and exposure I think is a very critical asset. It's an important asset, and it's one that obviously gives you a competitive advantage over other municipalities that are not located on the 401. But there could be other options that you could look at as long as that connectivity to the 401 is strong. Typically, we like to see industrial areas well buffered from sensitive areas like residential and agricultural uses. If you're looking at a more prestige employment area, more of an innovation type theme, there are, I think, more opportunities to look at a mix of uses. Typically, those types of innovation type districts that are focused around research and knowledge, they tend these days not to be located in industrial areas, so that would be something probably more related to a commercial office and sort of mixed use type development that would already be accommodated in your residential area. I think it's important to build on existing synergies, so typically we would want to build on areas where you have a well-established network of industrial uses and infrastructure. And it's important to strategically phase your employment areas over the next 25 years, looking at how much shovel-ready land you have versus how much, so lands that are serviced or serviceable, as opposed to lands that are designated but unserviced at this time and that could be available for development. We also took a look at the ownership of your industrial lands. There's right now a very limited amount of municipally owned lands for development, which can put some constraints on your ability to market your industrial areas given that sometimes some of these industrial lands that are owned by the private sector are essentially sitting vacant and land banked for long periods of time, and ultimately that can inhibit your ability to market and accommodate industrial lands. So just in conclusions, I was just going to sum up the overall numbers of the urban lands that we've identified. And so ultimately we've identified a total of 201 hectares of total urban lands for Chatham-Kent when we look at all the various land use types. And then for Dresden, we've identified 24 hectares in total. And then Tilbury, 18, and Blenheim, 4. And ultimately that gives us a total of 247 gross hectares. And if you like acres, that's about 610 acres of additional gross lands that would be required to accommodate growth across the municipality over the next 25 years. And one other thing just to point out is those lands don't accommodate lands that would be needed to be looked at that are currently protected through natural heritage or environmental systems. So when you're typically looking at expansion areas, those lands need to be netted out. So the actual delineation of expansion areas are going to be larger than that, the numbers that are quoted here. So again, this is the quantum of land that's required. The next step will be for the municipality through phase 2 or through the addendum, OP amendment, I should say, stage to look at the location options for urban growth. And that's going to need to look at various principles and criteria for urban expansion to evaluate where is the best location to expand boundaries, looking at planning, infrastructure requirements, market considerations, agricultural impacts, natural heritage impacts, for example. And that concludes my presentation, and happy to take any questions that you have.
Councillor Zakachi?
Thank you, Mayor Caniff. And through you to the speaker, just one question when it comes to, you indicated some of the stats that are projected for Ontario. If other parts of like the province isn't quite set up to build as fast as maybe it's predicted as you're stating, would that potentially increase our growth chance down here if we're more set up for the future? Because I'm guessing hearing a lot of the province is also in areas of concern in regards to development and shovel-ready land. So I was just curious to see if being more ready for this would be beneficial to Chatham to potentially increase our rates, so kind of manufactured a little bit by being a little bit more ready compared to our competitors.
Yeah, it's a really good question and a timely one. You've probably all seen the news released today from Municipal Affairs. I'm not sure if you have, about some of the unwinding of the current official plan recommendations that were made in the GTA and Greater Golden Horseshoe. And so I don't want to speculate too much on that right now, but I think right now there is some there's a bit of confusion going on across the province about how to best prepare, how to ultimately react and get ready through this environment that we're in through evolving and changing legislation with Bill 23 and Bill 97, and I think it is to some extent creating some challenges in terms of municipalities' ability to move forward and get ready, as you say, for that wave of development. So I think that there's a potential there, but I would say that we've already really taken a good look at that outward growth pressure that we think is ultimately going to come to southwestern Ontario and in here, obviously, today looking at Chatham-Kent. So I think to a large extent it's been factored into the forecast, but it's something that definitely needs to be monitored. And it's hard to project with precision where we're going to be a year over year, in a year-over-year period. But I would say that once we get through this next hurdle of peak interest rates, and ultimately we do see some signs that interest rates are plateauing, and maybe some signs that we may even see some relief, possibly into 2024. I think you're going to see a significant amount of demand resurfacing again in the residential market, and if you're ready for that demand, I think it will be here for you.
Thank you. Just one quick follow-up question to administration. So, Mr. McAllister, now that we've received this report, would then yourself and Gord's team potentially, kind of basically filtering through this and providing potential recommendations back to council at a future date? Is that kind of how this is going to work moving forward?
Thank you, Your Worship. The next part of this is actually the official plan process, and where we actually look at where are the options that are best to look at land expansion, and that'll occur throughout the course of the next year. That's a public process, so obviously we're dealing with private landowner interests through that process. So through that process, it'll help identify exactly where we probably should be expanding to, and then fundamentally that'll inform future capital needs as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's important to recognize that, as you stated, growth, whether it's a really important thing to municipalities, can be challenging at some times. And I think it makes it hard for us sometimes sitting around the horseshoe to make decisions, because a lot of the times the growth is in areas that are around existing communities, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge to make the right decision. But I think that knowing that we have to grow is important. And I think sometimes we have to recognize that when different applications are coming to council, that at the end of the day, it's a benefit to our entire municipality to grow and to kind of work through the changes, although they can be challenging. So thank you very much for your very detailed presentation.
Thank you.
Councilor McGrail?
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Can we go back a slide that we had the total just in, so in Chatham, that's almost 500 acres, just in Chatham itself. So that concerns me a little bit, that delicate balance between, producing food and accommodating people. So I don't know what the answer to this is, but I definitely challenge ourselves to be creative. Because obviously, does this also include, are we talking like houses, single-family houses, but apartment buildings and such too? But even with that, that just in Chatham, that's just under 500 acres. So we need to start being maybe a little bit more creative in how we're going to accommodate. Thank you.
Councilor Story, followed by Councilor Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Jamie, for that presentation. There's a lot in there to digest, and I'm still working my way through the 215 pages, but I really appreciate you speaking to us in more detail. Our 0.4% growth rate, as we mentioned, is modest, but considering what we have been recovering from, I think it's still good news for us. How are we doing with our comparators? Did you look at that in terms of similar sized communities? How are we measuring up right now with them?
Yeah, it's a good question. We definitely took a look at that. I don't have all the stats right in front of me, but I can tell you that we're working for a number of municipalities across southwestern Ontario and across the province. And what we typically are finding is that the growth rates are still highest in central Ontario in the GGH, and they tend to be strong along that 401 and 403 corridors. We get west outside of the GTA into Brants and Wellington, Waterloo, and even down into Oxford. And Middlesex, those growth rates are very high. And as we get further down the 401, closer to Chatham, the growth rates do start to dissipate here and in Lambton. So they are lower. They're a bit lower as well as when you get further off the 401. So when you get down into Elgin County, they're a bit lower. They're coming up everywhere though, and they're coming up in Huron and Bruce. And I would say that you're still a relatively modest growing municipality relative to many of the areas that we look at. You would be in that sort of definitely in that bottom sort of quarter of growth when we look at a survey of municipalities along that southwestern 401 corridor. But again, that growth rate has picked up quite significantly. I've not worked in that many areas in southern Ontario where we've actually seen losses in housing, let alone population in a municipality. And so compared to where we were when Bruce and I were working on this in 2012, things are looking really positive. And so I think there's a need to monitor this to see, ultimately where this is going. The province seems to, for a long time, they had a very modest outlook for many areas across southwestern Ontario, and their latest projections are picking up a lot of steam, and in some cases even getting a little higher than where we're at. And that's been an unusual situation that I've been in where I haven't seen that. But I still think that in some cases they're understating in some areas the potential for growth, particularly housing growth in outside of the larger urban areas. Like for example, the pledge that's been identified through the province I find very low. We're about 4 times that amount of housing growth. And yet in places like Brampton and Mississauga, they're looking at doubling and tripling the amount of housing relative to the OP. So I would really question some of that work, but I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and I think that the trend that we're seeing with this outward growth pressure is going to continue. And I think, just not to belabor this too much, but there's really a number of things that are driving that. It's one, you have housing affordability challenges in the larger urban centers, but you also have changes in the nature of work and how we're working with more hybrid and work at home opportunities, increases in telecommunications. And you also have a growing regional economy that's providing opportunities for individuals to live and work in Chatham or live and work in the commuter shed. And those factors, when you add them up, to me suggest that you're going to see more growth here for quite a while.
Thank you very much. I think I have a few more questions that might be to administration, but to go back to that 0.4% growth rate, do we, maybe to Bruce or to Ryan, do we currently have all the revenue streams that we need to grow any faster than that?
So I may look to Mr. Quinton to help me out here a little bit, but I think it comes down to, we're talking about land requirements here again over the next 25 years. So I think that's important to keep in mind in terms of how you allocate capital over time. The reality is we still have lots of land within our urban boundaries that will accommodate a lot of residential growth over the next, other than a few shortfalls over the next 15 years. And there's master planning work, and capital has been identified in our capital budget. So it's really a matter of how much council wants to allocate to new capital. Because right now, I'll look to what we allocate to capital is about a little over $7 million a year, and there's a lot of priorities there. So that's one of the challenges we do have. Obviously, we just implemented development charges last year. That's another revenue source. Without them, that's another lost revenue source to accommodate growth more expeditiously as well. And I think it's important that, as Jamie mentioned, you always continue to monitor this over time. Like every 5 years, we would subsequently do this larger review, just because things change over 5 years. So we're trying to look out 25 years from now, right? But if we find in the next few years that we're exceeding even these growth forecasts, obviously we'd be continue to monitor that and look at what our priorities should be.
Perhaps I'll just add a little bit. There's only so many revenue sources, right? And so upper level governments, that'd be great. There's debt financing development charges or the property tax bill. And we need to have council over the next 12 months as all this planning work is developed. We also have to be developing that long-term financial plan of how we need to get there, make sure all our master plans are getting updated for this type of growth. Particularly the underground systems as well. Where are we growing? Where are those water line sewers going to be put in? So it's not all just the property tax bill. It might be on might involve the PUC heavily as well. And we need to develop where we're going and what's the timeline to get there. And then we'll put together the potential funding where it might come from to get there, but we're talking hundreds of millions over a time frame here. We just have to define where we want to be and how quickly we want to be there.
Thanks, Gord. I appreciate that very much, because growth is great, but we certainly need to plan for it effectively, and we need the revenue streams to do that. To Councillor McGrill's point about getting creative. That certainly came to my mind when I was reading this too. The 66% of the last 20 years of residential permits were in Chatham, and 80% of new residential permits for the last 10 years were in Chatham. So certainly that's something that we need to keep thinking about. The other point I just wanted to mention is the demographic information and the housing. That just kept coming back because we're talking about housing, affordable housing, supportive housing, people struggling to find housing, the whole spectrum. That comes up every week at this council table, and I think probably all of us field questions about it as well. And that the 75 plus age group is the fastest growing group in CK. The numbers on that were quite surprising to me. I knew we were an aging community, but the numbers to see that projection was quite a lot higher than I realized. And you mentioned that with that aging population forecast, the need for more, and likely a preference too, folks who are aging 75 plus may not need the larger single family home. So need and preference for the mid-high density units. Now, are those definitions that are the same thing across the board, or is can you explain what mid-level and high-level density are? Are they the same definitions like in a Chatham or a Blenheim versus a Toronto or a Hamilton?
Yeah, I definitely can define that. So official plans are definitely going to be a little different in terms of how they would define density. So what you would identify as being medium density or high, or say medium density, for example, or low density, Toronto or Mississauga would not. They would typically identify anything that's grade related to be pretty much low density. So stacked townhomes, for example, could be permitted in a low density type designation. So it is something that does reflect the context of your community and how your official plan is established. But ultimately, when we prepare our numbers, we typically do pull them from Stats-Can and break those numbers down into categories of low, medium, and high density based on the Stats-Can definitions. And then it's up to the official plan and the planners to ultimately figure out how they want to then take that information and then use it in their official plan. So to get to your question, low density we typically is defined as single and semi-detached housing. Medium density we typically define as townhomes, including back-to-back townhomes and duplexes. High density we would typically assume anything else that's, so that could include stacked townhomes, triplexes, quadplexes, low-rise apartments, mid-rise apartments, and high-rise apartments would all form the high-rise definition.
Thank you. That's
or the high-density definition, I should say.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The senior 55 plus housing sounds like not immediately, but in the next 25 years, to Bruce's point, that will become a much stronger need for us to address. Does that come into play for, maybe this is an April question too, but does that come into a play for, will we need more long-term care facilities to address that? That's a large amount of growth. Does that mean we need to look at another Riverview Gardens or something along those lines? Because those are major costs investments, and that would be something that we would probably want to start investing in yesterday.
Yeah,
I'm sure with Gord's management, we're doing that very effectively already, but that did stick out to me, that will we need another long-term care home, for example?
And I can start with that response. And to start with it, I would say that I haven't specifically prepared a housing strategy that's looking at housing needs by tenure, affordability, or looking at certain segments of the market. But clearly with that amount of population growth in that 55 plus, and particularly the 75 plus category, it definitely would suggest that you will need more demand for other forms of seniors housing and various housing opportunities that have a variety of different care options for seniors. A lot of the work that I've done in this area of aging populations and aging in place, in my opinion, from the work I've done, is that individuals ultimately are looking for options to age in their community. And I think there's a lot of publications that were produced back by the CMHC years ago about that everyone wants to age in place and they don't want to leave their homes. And I think that there's a certain level of truth to that. But ultimately, I think a lot of that comes also with the fact that there are no other options for seniors to leave their existing home to age into another form of housing. So I think if those options were provided, you would see more residents looking at those options to age in their community. Because I think that's something that is most residents hold very strong to them, that they want to be near their friends, their family, their amenities, their doctors. They don't want to necessarily leave, but they don't have options. So I definitely think there's a need. And I would just say that you're not immune or alone in this issue of an aging population. Many of the communities that I look at are seeing significant growth rates, typically in the range of double the overall average rate of growth that we're seeing for the municipality as a whole.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Appreciate it.
Councillor Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. I can certainly understand talking about the amount of land that is required, but that's not necessarily like land distance. Like you could go up, right? Like is that where the concept of going up instead of out would come from? And then would it be part of strategic planning and land use to then look to specific land for commercial and employment area, and then look to land that we potentially already have and are already utilizing to then go up instead of out? Like it would still provide the same amount of, say, residential housing. And then ultimately it would also help with the aging population then, right? That they may not want their own grass to cut and whatever else. They may want more of a high-rise building. Like, is that something that strategically moving forward, and this is maybe a question for administration, is that something that we look at to say, like, let's reserve our land for commercial and employment use and look at maybe stuff that we already have to go up instead of out?
Yeah, I can definitely start with a response to that question, and I think it's a really good one. And it sort of echoes Councillor McGrail's comments as well. So we've looked at a land requirement based on assumptions that we think are appropriate in terms of density for residential uses and non-residential uses, looking at market trends and ultimately how demographic and economic forces are likely going to influence the density and the built form of residential and non-residential development over the long term. We've also looked thoroughly at the intensification opportunities within each of the primary and secondary urban centers across Chatham-Kent to see where there are opportunities to accommodate infill and redevelopment. And we've come back to a conclusion that a 10% target we think is an appropriate target, which is in accordance with the official plan. And then we've also looked at opportunities to intensify existing industrial areas where you've seen some areas turn over the last 15 years or so through those tough times that I mentioned in the early 2000s. A lot of those lands are starting to have already reoccupied, but there still are some opportunities left for intensification that have already been factored into the analysis. But that doesn't suggest that you can't be creative and you can't be innovative and explore different scenarios. One thing that we didn't do in this study is we didn't explore different scenarios to go to look at more dense options than ultimately what you're currently achieving in your official plan or what we think the market and economic forces would deliver. But the only risk to doing that is if you are too dense and ultimately are forcing densities beyond what is a sort of reasonable expectation from a market standpoint, then you may ultimately shortchange yourselves in terms of the amount of land that's required. But there's certainly nothing to prohibit you to looking at a scenario that would look at a higher intensification target, for example, to see what is the sensitivity that would have on that 201 hectare number. And so something that could be done through Watson or could be led by staff prior to working through the amendment. I don't want to necessarily suggest things that staff would do or that you would do, but those are potentially options, and those are typical approaches that we would get into looking at different scenarios for growth for municipalities.
Councillor Wright?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Most of our boundaries were set before the amalgamation, were they not, for the towns and the villages and the city? Like, we haven't taken much farmland since amalgamation, have we, or can anybody answer that?
You want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you, Your Worship. That's essentially correct, Councillor Wright. So before amalgamation, we had 21 different plans. the first version of our official plan in the early mid-2000s. Didn't claw back any of those urban boundaries. They essentially pulled forward what was in those plans for growth. Through the economic downturn, as Jamie mentioned, late 2000s, when we did this in 2011, the reality is we had more supply than we actually needed to accommodate our growth then. So there was no boundary expansions since that time. So this is the first time that we're actually seeing the need for some expansions over the next 25 years.
Okay, seeing no other questions, Councillor B. McGregor and Councillor Jubinville, can I get you to move this, please?
So moved.
I second.
Okay, seeing no other questions, so I'll put it to vote.
Councillor C. McGregor,
Yes.
Councillor Bondi.
Yes.
Thank you. All votes are in. Motion passes 17-0.
Okay, we'll go to notice of motion. Councillor Doyle.
Thank you, Mayor. I, Councillor Ryan Doyle, hereby provide notice that I will bring the following motion at the October 30th, 2023 council meeting for discussion and voting. Whereas during the previous term of council, the Natural Heritage Committee of the Whole received a report titled Public Consultation for Woodlot Preservation Options in March of 2022 that outlined a recommended process for additional public consultation, the various ways that education, incentive, and regulation woodlot preservation tools might be configured, and a recommended configuration for each woodlot preservation tool to use as a basis for the proposed public consultation. And whereas Council passed a motion on September 25th, 2023 to repeal the temporary clear-cutting bylaw number 72-2021, therefore be it resolved that administration prepare an updated report for the March 4th, 2024 council meeting outlining the potential incentive options only, both to encourage the preservation of existing woodlots and to encourage the expansion of tree cover across the municipality. The report shall also propose options for further public consultation regarding the various incentive options. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to non-agenda business. Councillor Crew, Councillor Sakat, then followed by Councillor Scotchy.
Thank you, Mayor Caniff. Council, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and I think that most of you are aware that our friend and colleague, Councillor Melissa Harrigan, is due to come back next week. So I know that recognizing Breast Cancer Awareness Month, that's going to be like the last day of the month, but I think it's fitting that we recognize and acknowledge our own warrior that has been missing for almost a year. So in honor of her return, we all have, I think most of us have, Her Fight is Our Fight t-shirts that we bought last year when she began her campaign, her courageous campaign during her battle. And if we all wore that, staff, everyone that has that, it would be a really, really good honor. And she's aware that I'm bringing this up tonight, so it's not a surprise. But if we all wore that, or just wore pink, or something like to that effect, and if you need a Her Fight is Our Fight t-shirt, I'm sure she can find you one if you just email her. But if we could all do that next Monday, it'll be a warm welcome for her as she returns to her seat. And we miss her, she knows that, and y'all know that, and so it's going to be a warm welcome for her for Breast Cancer Awareness Month.
Great idea. Councillor Sakat, followed by Councillor Pinsino.
Thank you, Mayor Caniff, and through you, I did touch base with Mr. Jacques before the meeting. The developer from a recent planning application at 125 McNaughton Street has reached out to me several times about the deferral that took place back in June, and he wanted me to ask in open council, since it's been quite some time, when we could expect to be seeing that on the agenda again, given the fact that it's been several months. So I don't know if Ryan can provide an update.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Councillor. The Planning Department and myself, most specifically, continue to actively consult with this applicant currently. I know it's been several months, but I believe the applicant is preparing to move forward now, and will be prepared potentially for the December planning meeting. Again, I'm not entirely in control of that, but I'll undertake best efforts to make sure it gets here in December or soon after.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I appreciate that.
Councillor Pincinel, followed by Councillor Story.
Thank you, Worship. I'd like to invite the public out to Southwest Woodlot Association, who is a chapter of the Ontario Woodlot Association, for their fall tour, and it's out in Thamesville this year. 23652 Industrial Road, which is Highway 21 north of Thamesville. This property is managed through Forest Tax Plan, Endangered Species Management, Invasive Species Management, Habitat Management, and more. This is Saturday, November 4th, from 10 a.m. till noon. And this is open to anybody who's interested in trees and forests, so invite a friend. I'm going to hand this to the clerk so she can put it in our minute or our sheets for next week, so everybody can see it. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Story, followed by Councillor Jubenville.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have one question for staff and two quick announcements. One for Edward. Just regarding the timeline for construction and ideally completion of the Merlin Road and Queens Line roundabout in light of the construction news we had last week about the Bloomfield Road 401 exit being closed for quite some time, as well as the 401 closures for the work they're doing, and that one of the potential detour routes is Queens Line. So I just wanted to check on when that roundabout construction will happen in that time frame. Thanks.
Thank you, through the mayor to the councillor. Timely question. We actually have a report going to council next week on Monday related to the retention of a consultant for the design, inspection, and contract them in for that project. It's anticipated once council gives us that approval, we'll be completing the design, going out to tender in early 2024, and majority of the work should be done by end of 2024 with some cleanup probably in 2025, which would be before the MTO work.
That's great. Thank you. And then two quick notes. Just to let you know that on this day in 1934, the Chatham Colored All-Stars became the first all-black team to win a Provincial Ontario Baseball Association championship. So that's a pretty important day in our collective history. And there's lots of ways to learn about this very historic and important baseball team. CK Black Historical Society, University of Windsor have books and websites and all sorts of social media content as well. Amherstburg Freedom Museum as well. So highly encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in this important milestone today. And also tomorrow night, Tuesday, is Pizza for Polio for the Rotary Club of Chatham. And there's multiple very generous pizzerias in Chatham contributing to our polio eradication efforts of Rotary across the globe. So if you're hungry tomorrow at any point, please consider ordering pizza. And even if you're not in Chatham, the Rotary clubs of other communities in Chatham-Kent are also doing their polio fundraisers with other types of food. So please consider supporting your local Rotary club this week in their polio eradication efforts. Thank you.
Councillor Jubenville, followed by Councillor Finn.
Thank you, Mayor. This past Saturday, a few of us from around the Horseshoe attended Breakfast on the Farm through Farm and Food Care Ontario. It took place at Laprise Farms, Canada's largest Brussels sprouts producer out in Pancor. Approximately 600 urban, rural, and agricultural visitors came from Chatham-Kent and beyond. We enjoyed a breakfast made entirely from Ontario-grown products, along with a chance to explore the greenhouse, watch the harvesting and processing of Brussels sprouts, and learn more about food and farming through exhibits and agricultural organizations. A lot of food sampling, interactive engagement. It was a great family and educational event, and it was nice to see so many people out on the farm. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I imagined seeing Councillor Finn's hand, but it didn't go up. I just want to add one thing to that. I wanted to wish all the councillors a happy anniversary today. You're all celebrating your 1st, your 5th, your 9th, your 13th, or in Councillor Pincinel's, your 17th anniversary today. So happy anniversary, everyone. With that, we'll move to reading the bylaws. Councillor Pincinel and Councillor Finn, can I get you move the first and second reading, please?
So moved, Your Worship.
So seconded.
Anyone opposed? Motion carried. Third and final reading. Councillor Thompson and Councillor McGrail. Can I get you moved to the third and final reading, please?
So moved.
So seconded.
Anyone opposed? Motion carried. Resolution of council. Councillor Crew, and then I'll have Councillor Wright, since he celebrated his birthday early October.
I move that Chatham-Kent Council adjourn to its next meeting to be held on Monday, October 30th, 2023, and that Chatham-Kent Council authorize itself to meet in closed session on that day to discuss any matters permitted by the Municipal Act. And if I may add, we will be going back in camera to finish up our business from earlier. So moved.
I'll second that, thank you.
Okay, Madam Clerk, would you like to add in something?
Councillor Crew nailed it.
Oh, she's all over it. All right. Anyone opposed to adjourning the open session at 7:17? Seeing none, we're off back to closed.